Have you ever had an experience where you heard a phrase that was so profound and resonated so deeply, it changed everything about every conversation you had from that point on? I had an experience like that. I was sitting in a conference and I heard the teaching pastor talk about a way to deal with conflict that set a shift in me that I'd like to share with you. He said, learn to share the final 10%. And he went on from there to say, most of the time when we are in conflict with people, we tend to share maybe 80 to 90% of what we're really feeling, what's really bugging us, or what really needs to be addressed. And there's a lot of reasons why we do that. We don't want to be misunderstood. We don't want to be mean. We don't want to be a problem child. And so our tendency is to say, okay, this is what I'm feeling. This is what's going on. And then we hint at the part that really bugs us. And what happens when we do that? Well, generally speaking, we don't understand what the other person is saying, and we know they're trying to say something important, but we're really not clear on what it is that they're trying to communicate. I remember, for example, early in our own marriage, my wife grew up in a home where there was very little conflict. And yet, when she was a 13-year-old girl, her father left and her parents were divorced. And what that created in her own mind was this message that if people can divorce with very little conflict, what will happen when there is conflict and the conflict is, intense? And so as a result, early on in our marriage, Kara wouldn't just not share the final 10%, like she wouldn't share like the final 50%. And I remember many conversations where I knew she was upset about something, but she didn't really want to say the core issue because she was afraid of what the consequences might be of doing so. In fact, I remember after one particular challenging conversation, we were sitting in the living room and I got on my knees and I held her and I said, just tell me what's bugging you. I want to know. And she was finally able to start talking a little bit about the core of the issue as she saw it. Now, over time, and after 42 years of marriage, she's gotten a lot better at sharing the final 10%. But it's a great example of what I think happens in many relationships, where people are just unwilling to talk about the core of the core of the core. So they're having conflict, they're trying to deal with the subject, and rather than talking about that, they hint at it, hoping that that will be enough, leaving the person on the other hand kind of in question or confused about what really is at the issue, the heart of the issue. And so what I want to encourage you to do is to experiment with sharing the final 10%, to go all the way to the core of the core. Here's what the issue is. Now, some of you might try to anticipate that, and you're thinking to yourself, well, I know how that's going to go. That's not going to be well received. That's going to just lead to a bigger blow up. Well, let me give you a couple of hints about doing this well, and I'm going to pay your dumb tax because this is something we had to learn the hard way. But there are a couple of things that I think work in tandem with this idea that help it to be easier to be received. So, for example, there's a lot of value in introducing the final 10% with a few qualifiers. In other words, what I mean by that is start by saying a few things, and you have to be sincere about this. Start by saying some things like, you know what, I know you love me, and I know that this is a good relationship and I want to maintain the quality of this relationship. But there's something I need to talk about that may be difficult. And I may not say it really well, but I want to be able to deal with this issue because it's really important to me. And I'm going to trust that it's important to you. Well, when you set up a hard thing with that kind of introduction, it has a lot easier way of being received, because you're right away kind of taking some things off the table that might be triggering points or hooking points that cause the conversation to go offline. So just start by thinking through, what are some things I can say on the front end that might help, grease the wheels, so to speak, to let that other person know I'm just talking about this one thing, and this is not a signal that there's all these other things that I'm not talking about that are a problem. Here's the one thing I want to address, and let's go ahead and talk through that. Secondly, I would encourage you to say things like, and I mentioned it here in the intro, that you would just ask for permission to say it poorly. Now, that doesn't mean that you can just go off willy-nilly and cuss and call names and whatever. I'm just saying that give yourself and ask for permission to say, you know what, I'm learning how to do this. I'm probably not going to do it very well. I want to get better at it, but in this particular instance, since this is new and I'm trying to get better at it, please extend to me, and I like this little word picture, an umbrella of grace as I try and talk about this hard thing. And again, just saying it in that way gives a little bit of cushion if you don't say it exactly right and well. And then the final thing that I have found works really well when you're trying to work through the final 10% is always end the conversation with a word of affirmation. Like, thank you for being willing to hear me. Thank you for listening to this. Thank you for taking it seriously. That in itself means so much to me. If you add those various components, like qualifying well, asking for an umbrella of grace, concluding with a word of affirmation, then sharing the final 10% will make every conflict much more productive. Now, some people would say, I just don't like conflict. Well, that makes it all the more reason to do this. Because when you aren't willing to share the final 10%, the likelihood of you having more conflict because the person didn't understand what you were trying to say just goes up. And so for the person who hates conflict, this may even be a more important principle. So yeah, take the risk. Learn how to share the final 10%. I promise you, it will serve you well.